Welcome to this inaugural lecture. I'm Vice Principal Jeff Haywood. It's my pleasure and honour to host the lecture this evening. Welcome to all of you. Welcome especially to James's mother and his brother and his wife of 3 days, I'm told. I'm sure. We're here to hear James give his inaugural lecture for his chair of African and Development Studies, and I think that the size of the audience and the sort of the animation and the fact that you've struggled here through the snow and the ice, the declining snow and the ice, is a really good sign. James took his first degree in the University of Dundee, Geography and Environmental Science, and then moved to South Africa to the University of Witwatersrand, where he took his Masters and his PhD. He then came back to Edinburgh, so clearly the sunshine and the wine of South Africa wasn't sufficient of an attractant. He came back to the University of Edinburgh as a research fellow in the ESRC Inogen Centre, and then to a lectureship in African Studies, becoming senior lecturer, and now an appointment this year to the chair of African and Development Studies. He's co-director of the Centre of African Studies and the founding director of the Global Development Academy, one of the major planks in our internationalization strategy. His research interests are the role that science and technology plays in the alleviation of poverty and international development. He's edited and authored 5 books and over 35 papers. Principal investigator, co-principal investigator on a range of multi-million-pound collaborative interdisciplinary research projects, and most recently been appointed as a strategic advisor to the DFID ESRC Research for Poverty Alleviation. He says that living in South Africa, a long way from the sea, one of the attractants of coming back to Edinburgh was the sea and the wind. Well, I'd say that the attraction of the sea doesn't diminish, but after 30 years in Edinburgh, I can tell you that the wind and the cold you never ever get used to. So, with more ado, I'd like to present James, who will give his inaugural lecture. It's a sign of a really good University of Edinburgh professor that they can keep their cool while the tech team struggles to get the PowerPoint to work. James did remarkably well on that one. James.
Oh, I see it's not working again.
Well, see if he keeps his cool.
Thank you.
Okay. Are you
I hope you can hear me. I suspect you probably can't see because nothing else seems to work. I've learned from some of my other professorial colleagues that a great way to start a presentation is to fiddle and faff with PowerPoint quite a lot, looking at nobody in particular, Jonathan Spencer. Talking about making poverty history, it's really a play on Oxfam's campaign of the late 1990s and early 2000s, and talking very much about the promise of science for international development. Can science alleviate poverty? If it can't, why not? And what role should science play? And you may wonder why I have a picture of a Volkswagen Beetle up on my screen here. I say my screen, but it's really the technician's screen. Basically, I thought I've been to a few of these lectures recently. I thought it's a good way to kind of swat up on how these things kind of work. And people often start with a personal vignette, little story, which is kind of a bit self-deprecating, makes you seem like a good guy. So I thought I would do the same. So basically, my Beetle, when I first moved to Johannesburg in '96, it's far from the sea, which is quite useful because it means that things don't rust. It doesn't rain very much. So you can buy a Beetle considerably older than me for a couple of £1,000, and I had the brilliant plan to drive it around southern Africa within 5 months of moving there. So I thought this is a good thing to do, following in the footsteps of people like Robert Moffat and David Livingstone. I was going to do a Southern African great trip. Wrong screen. So I had the brilliant idea, it seemed brilliant at the time, to firstly I went to Zimbabwe, that went fine. Then I went to Kafue National Park in Zambia. This is actually to scale. When you drive through southern Africa, you drive for a day and a half and you're still in the same country, you quickly lose all sense of perspective. And I had the brilliant idea to try and drive a Beetle through this national park. So I got to the entrance, here, and I said to the gamekeeper, who had a bicycle, Zambia, it's a very, very deserted park, can I drive through the park? Meaning, of course, will my Volkswagen Beetle 1968 make it through the park? And he said, of course you can, you're welcome. So I misinterpreted this somewhat and thought that meant my car will physically make it through the park. So I drove north for about 90 miles, 90 kilometers, and I quickly realized, because it was a very sandy road, that I was going to get stuck. So momentum was taking me through the deeper and deeper sand until ultimately I ground to a halt. It seemed like a bit of an adventure at the time, stuck in sand, stick some trees under the wheels and drive off. After a day and a half, I got a bit worried. I had a litre of liquid fruit juice, for those of you who know South Africa, which isn't very tasty. And then I had the brilliant idea, being an academic, where can I get water from? And I thought, I know, the radiator. So I spent half a day working out the Beetles don't have radiators because they're air-cooled. And I can see my colleagues from engineering and my brother, who's a helicopter pilot, looking utterly ashamed of me. So basically, Robert Moffat, David Livingstone, was turning more into William Boyd, a kind of a good man in Africa, a big disaster. I had this kind of idea I was going to kind of starve to death in this game reserve. And I would probably end up, and this kept flashing through my mind, on the front page of the Dundee Courier. 4 months in Africa, that was it, 22 years old, how embarrassing. And knowing in the last week, the Dundee Courier's main headlines have been large icicles found on buildings. So I definitely would have made it into the front page. Luckily, amazingly, some might say, maybe there's more to it than just luck. I was saved by American missionaries who happened to be driving through the park in a gigantic 4x4. That's another story I won't go into. I did actually learn some lessons from this, which is really kind of the point. The lessons really were, I think, about expertise and access. You can gain access to a park. It doesn't mean you have the expertise to get through it. And you can, I think, also overestimate your expertise and think that you can cope with any situation. And clearly I could not. I also learned two other things. I learned it's important to think a bit more about communication. Just because somebody says, of course you can, doesn't mean in that culture, in that context, I can. It might mean something totally different, as I found to my cost. And I think it's also important, in retrospect, to understand a bit about how things work. Maybe don't take technology quite for granted. Maybe look inside the car, the black box of the car, and think a bit about how one might actually store water in the boot, for example, which is in the front in a Volkswagen Beetle. There's, of course, a third issue, which is a kind of broader issue. When I drove into the park, there were 3 other vehicles in the park, which is geographically the size of Wales. 3 vehicles patrolling the park for poachers. It's an enormous place. No resources in Zambia, very, very poor country. Most of the people in the park were driving around on pedal bicycles. And that's really the third issue, which is kind of the reason why I moved to South Africa in the first place, and the main thing which has underpinned my research since then. Zambia today is, in some ways, a bit of a depressing place. Maybe a disappointing place is more appropriate word. The UN's Human Development Index is 150th out of 169 countries who submit to being ranked, and that's a compound index which measures literacy, life expectancy, general health, education, quality of life in some simple way. The GDP per capita is $1,000 per person. It's a 30th of the UK, a 35th of the UK, and the per capita average income is $400 US. Life expectancy at birth this year is 38 years. And partly that's because of HIV/AIDS, and the impact of that on life there, but it's particularly low. At independence, in the 60s, I hope that's right, being a professor of African studies, I'm guessing. Sorry to Paul Nugent, who's a professor of African history. The per capita average income was $1,200. So Zambia has suffered a retreat in lots of ways from the promise of development. Life expectancy at birth was close to 60 years. And I think James Ferguson, in his book about Zambia, captured it quite well. He said in the 60s, Africa was emerging. It was always moving out of poverty, moving to another state of development, of promise for the future, of a better tomorrow. But by the 1980s, Zambia was a case of a promise in retreat, a case of modernity rolling backwards. So this idea of moving forwards towards a world like the West, like the North, in Zambia kind of failed, partly due to the collapse of the price of copper and partly due to structural adjustment, the shrinking of the state, development kind of folded back on itself and it moved away, moved out of people's grasp, and the future became something of a dream, the future that people had envisioned for themselves. And I think that's the kind of background through which we must think about science and technology for development. And I'll come back to Zambia in a moment. So the other thing I noticed with these kinds of talks is you have to show where you did your field work, which is quite lucky for me because it was somewhere exotic. I feel it's more tricky for my colleagues who work in Edinburgh, for example, you know, my exotic pictures of me in my little hut with my little cows outside. So my PhD was 98 to 2001. It's a study based on the border of Botswana and South Africa, on the Malopo River, looking at the way in which people constructed livelihoods in the face of environmental change, climatic change, and the changing of the state, the emergence of a post-apartheid South Africa. And digging a bit back into the past in this community, Isaac Shapiro, who was a mentor to the Comoros, spent all his career working with these communities. In the 1930s, he documented at least 17 breeds of sorghum, which are regularly planted by the Setswana. And they would plant different varieties they'd bred themselves depending on when the rainy season was going to onset, how long they expected the rainy season to be, and the sorts of food they had to produce themselves and for their livestock. So quite sophisticated. By the 60s, by the time this community had become part of what would become a homeland in the South African sense, everybody was planting one variety of maize. That indigenous knowledge, that indigenous scientific of knowledge, to quote Paul Richards, had kind of been lost and swept away. And Macquarie, the community here, is split in two by the river. The river's the border, and there's examples of one house you'd have one brother in South Africa, and a house 50 meters away you would have the other side of the family who were in Botswana. And you might imagine this was a problem, but the border was non-existent. It was a river and a piece of chicken wire. And despite the reach of the apartheid state and the promise of the post-apartheid state, people in this particular community were basically untouched by the reach of the state. They were living their life apart from development, apart from the promise of what the state could deliver to them. And that's, I think, another important thing. The limits of post-colonial state in Africa, I think, can't be underestimated in lots of cases. And some of the examples of technology I'll talk about today, I think, really underline that. Apologies to the master students who are in the room, because this is probably about the 5th time you've seen this slide. This is a great quote. This is the quote that every kind of development critique starts with. Harry Truman, his inaugural address in 1948, the kind of post-war promise of a better world. We must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas. More than half the people of the world are living in conditions approaching misery. Their food is inadequate, they are victims of disease, their economic life is primitive and stagnant. For the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and skills to relieve the suffering of these people. And thinking of Zambia, of life expectancy today as opposed to the early 60s, of average income today as opposed to 60s, we have to ask ourselves, what went wrong? Where was the failure? I think the other thing it's important to recognize with this quote was the kind of dichotomization of the world it created, the sense of global versus local, global solutions to local problems, of modern versus traditional. Primitive, stagnant life will be replaced by shiny, modern laptops that don't work with PowerPoint and bottled water, which I'll need quite soon. And scientific versus indigenous knowledge, one knowledge being better than another, offering more than another. And these kind of dichotomizations, I think, frame the notion of access, which I mentioned before, and define expertise. And again, thinking about international development, the people who practice it, the institutions that reproduce it, and thinking about science, the universities, the people with PhDs, and maybe even the professors. The expertise is defined by those things, institutions, signifiers. Again, another slide I recycle again and again. I just Googled it, it's not mine. Representing in a different way this kind of, over time, this march towards a common future from a traditional society through all these steps to become more like us. And I always mention again in my lecture on this that high mass consumption, this is Ristow's, from Ristow's Anti-Communist Manifesto. He was a highly influential US foreign policy advisor. And his definition of high mass consumption, the epitome of development, of developed, is mass consumption of consumer durables. That's the future. That's what we must aspire to. And given that the day after our wedding, my brand new mother-in-law managed to break both our washing machine and dishwasher, I suspect we've probably slipped down, probably back to takeoff. But we'll get there again. And my mother-in-law did take off and flew back to Italy yesterday as well, so that was good. So again, what this suggests is a universal future, a future we all must follow. We're all going to follow the same path and go to the same place. Individual history gets replaced by universal history. A universal future replaces the possibility of multiple futures. Helsinki becomes a blueprint for the long way. Finland's often used as an example of a small developed country which Malawi should follow. Scotland becomes a mentor for Malawi. These things happen because of this kind of shared sense of one future, one way to get there. Everything becomes a transfer of one state to another, a transfer of knowledge, of technologies, neutral and contextless, apolitical. And I think the apolitical neutrality resonates through narratives of development. Development's a good thing. The application of technology is a good thing. Developments like apple pie, motherhood, ice cream on a hot sunny day. Everybody likes these things. Everybody should accept these things. Nobody should reject these things. To reject these things would almost be perverse. And the application of technology, of a new laptop, is a good thing too, although I'm beginning to regret this particular one. And again, this is the kind of critique that one can use to look at science and the creation of technology. The University of Edinburgh has a particular role in the history of understanding, critiquing the role of science in society. And again, critiquing the way in which scientists behave, the way in which development practitioners behave, and understanding they behave as normal people, like all of us, I think is a particular University of Edinburgh contribution to these sorts of issues. So essentially, the fundamental concern of my own research is really this. I tell my PhD students, you're not ready to submit your PhD until you can describe it in one sentence. So clearly I ignore my own advice. Despite the range of science and technological advances, despite all the things we have around us, which have helped in many respects, particularly with regards to education and health and concrete things, we find ourselves in a world where poverty still endures, where poverty in some cases gets worse, where it endures in particular parts of the world and is manifesting it in other parts of the world. Since World War II, the 50, 60-year history of international global development, almost half the world's population still live on less than $2 a day. The average daily subsidy of a European cow from the Common Agricultural Policy is €2 a day, which is quite a lot more than $2 a day. So that puts things in context. 1 billion people do not have enough food to eat. And significant numbers of these people are in developed countries as well. 70 million in the US are thought to be food insecure. And global changes, climate change, globalization, the credit crunch, food price rises, the things which are happening around us today affect the poorest most profoundly. And this is a huge political question. It's not just a question of the role of science and technology, but I still maintain that science and technology can be used in a more appropriate way to deal with some of these issues. And I think part of the answer lies in the kind of complex relationships between policy and practice. Is policy neutral? Does policy set out an appropriate way for us to behave to alleviate these sorts of problems? I would suggest not. It's more complex than that. And particularly it lies in understanding the role of particular sorts of institutions that mediate the relationship between policy, between what people say we should do, and practice, how we actually behave, how professionals behave. And I think there's a very normative perspective of science, technology, and development, a kind of rational discourse that you see again and again in policy documents. The technological capacity can bring the yawning divide between North and South. It can bridge that divide. It's a House of Lords report from 2 years ago. Technology can suture these differences. It can fix these problems. The next quote is from a UN Millennium Report on Science, Technology, and Development, a very influential report. Economic historians suggest that the success of today's industrialized countries lies in their history of innovation along different dimensions: institutions, technology, trade, organization, and the application of natural resources. So if you behave in a certain way, you can realize the potential of technology to set you free, make you globally competitive, make you the kind of country that you might want to be. And I think partial readings of history, such as you can see here in dependency, prioritize particular developmental interventions. So we can say, well, economic historians may well be right, that the success of industrialized countries is due to their history of innovation, but they did other sorts of things alongside that: colonization, a whole bunch of wars, a whole set of things which aren't read into this kind of history. So in some ways, it's a fundamentally conservative approach. The application of science, technology, and difference is the root of all, science, technology, and development is the root of all difference. That's the only thing we have to solve. And in other senses, it's almost impossibly revolutionary. Only science, technology, and development can make all the difference. So it's the problem and the solution. And again, that's something that you often see resonating again and again through development discourse and development practice and policy. So going back to this kind of linear teleology, to quote Ferguson, this linear teleology, I think, repeats itself in many ways, which kind of then feeds into international development thinking. Science, evidence, policy, innovation, technology, impact. Things are received, are explained, are thought to happen in this very linear way. You move logically, step by step, from one to the other. That's how things change. That's how the world will become a better place. Knowledge transfers in one direction. Expertise transfers in one direction. Learning transfers in one direction only, which again builds on the hierarchy of expertise and access to technologies, access to knowledge. So again, we kind of follow each other through a universal history. There's no individual history here. We learn from other people, we copy them, we replicate, and that sets us free. Everything becomes a transfer of one state to another. It's kind of repetitious. If we're not moving through this, up this linear kind of step-by-step process, we're just doing something wrong. It's our responsibility. I think, though, that there are things which show that things are actually much more complex in reality. Everything isn't so straightforward. If I develop a new technology, it doesn't mean that you have access to it. If I have a bottle of water, it's mine unless I give it to you. You don't automatically have a right to my water. And I think this particular example of a drug is a really good example of what I'm talking about. And this is a doff of my cap to my colleagues here who work on sleeping sickness in sub-Saharan Africa. 60 million people in sub-Saharan Africa are at risk of sleeping sickness, leading to approximately 300,000 new infections a year. And because sub-Saharan Africa people live in extreme poverty, there's essentially no incentive, no market demand to develop new medicines. So no new medicine until very recently has been developed since well before World War II. And the main effective treatment for late-stage sleeping sickness, the kind of late stage before you die when infections cross the blood-brain barrier, kills about 10% of patients outright and is unresponsive in 30%. So it's a huge problem, but it's not a problem that actually ignites the fancy of pharmaceutical companies. In the 1970s, however, eflornithine, which is the skeletal structure here, was a potential anti-cancer drug, was identified as a potential treatment for late-stage sleeping sickness. And by the mid-80s, WHO had run trials, and it was actually very, very successful. It was known as the resurrection drug. It would pull people back from the brink. So by 1990, it was licensed as a sleeping sickness treatment, and it was the first new drug for 40 years. The drug was expensive. It's very complex to use, about $800 a treatment. So after 5 years, it was discontinued by the drug company because there was no profit in it. They couldn't see any reason to produce this drug. By 2000, the way these things worked, there had been several mergers. A new drug company had emerged, and they noticed that one of the side effects of eflornithine was hair loss. And they then decided to license the drug as a topical formulation for hair removal, particularly for the North American market. And I think, gosh, I've lost my best quote. This is the problem with my stupid computer not working. And the stop-start history of eflornithine, I think, represents the issues of access, priority, and responsibility which underpin technology. And Vanaquer, which was the kind of the name of the drug in the American market, is a great from an academic perspective, but terrible from a social justice perspective quote from a spokesperson who said, "Oh, before we discovered Vanaquer, there's no point to create eflornithine because there was no need. So the only need is hair removal, facial hair removal. The need of treating people in Africa was just invisible there." And I think this very simple structure speaks to this whole larger political economy, this hierarchy of access to medicine, access to new technology, which I think underpins a lot of what I'm talking about. Something very small to something very, very large. International science, the globalization of science, the creation of global international scientists who strode around the world, solving problems, identifying problems and creating solutions. Rose out to the 1950s and 1960s, again, this post-World War II development era. And this here is a picture of the campus of the International Rice Research Institute, which is based in Los Baños in the Philippines. Opened in 1960 as a central place where rice would be fixed. The problem of malnutrition and food insecurity in Southeast Asia would be fixed in this one place. Modeled on a US land-grant university campus. I'm not sure which one. I think it may have been Virginia Tech, but I know there's Virginia Tech graduate here, so that's probably not a good one to guess at. Anyway, it was a blueprint purchased by the Rockefeller Foundation, dumped down in the Philippines. Idea being that you can see on the right of the image here that the kind of small field plots where they grow different varieties of rice. You could solve the problem here and just apolitically transport the solution around Southeast Asia. And these are pictures from IRI from my last trip. You can see on the right-hand side of the right-hand image, you've got the traditional rice variety, which grows quite tall. Rice is very susceptible to the addition of fertilizer. It grows very, very quickly. What tends to happen is it produces too much rice grain, it falls over, collapses, and then the rice is spoiled. So all they were trying to do was develop a shorter, stockier, I hesitate to say more Scottish variety of rice, which could take the fertilizer, would also not put so much of its energy into producing a woody structure and could actually contain more rice. And that's the root of the Green Revolution. Something simple like reshaping the morphology of a rice plant. And this one structural change was seen as a solution to food insecurity across the massive region of the world, over 2 billion people. And I think it speaks to a lot of the issues of global science and global international development, which is really about reducing the problems of development to the smallest possible isolable unit, the isolable issue. So it's all about yield per hectare. If you fix yield per hectare, you'll alleviate the threat of communism. You'll feed people because food will be transported around the world and everybody will look after each other and it'll be great. And it has become a blueprint. IRI's became a blueprint for significant investment in agricultural science, global agricultural science centers across the world. And I'll mention a couple of others a bit later on. The current investment from donors is about $500 million US per annum. And that's been the level of investment more or less for the last 40 years. So a significant amount of money in this kind of very top-down, global, heavy approach. There's well-documented problems with the Green Revolution, which I won't speak about very much today because that's really a different talk. But there were too many assumptions made around production systems. The idealized production systems of the rice paddy don't necessarily, of the trial, don't translate into the rice paddy. Putting lots of fertilizer and chemicals into water has issues for longer-term environmental problems. And of course, unsurprisingly, wealthier farmers tended to benefit a lot more than poorer farmers. So it wasn't this developmental bottom-up solution. It was a much more complex, nuanced thing than that. Became a model, though. But what I'm going to talk about now, and this is really for the African studies people amongst us, is the real Green Revolution, which happened in Africa about 20 years earlier in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia at the time. In the 1930s, the Salisbury Agricultural Research Station was set up to give Rhodesian commercial farmers a comparative advantage. They were being outcompeted by African farmers who could exploit their labor a bit more effectively. So they were working with hybrid varieties of maize since 1949. And in 1960, before they'd even opened IRI, SR52 was launched as the first maize variety, hybrid maize variety. SR52 is a very imaginative name. It's a typical acronym, Southern Rhodesia. And it kind of swept across southern Africa. It was picked up by commercial farmers. They increased their yields by about 250% within a decade. It really made them competitive internationally in terms of producing maize. But by the 1970s and 80s, there were discrepancies in who was buying maize and who was planting and growing it that were noticed by the wholesalers. And a whole black market of hybrid maize had risen up. And small-scale African farmers were using it too. Not for high yields, but because it grew more quickly, so it was better in periods of drought. So this rice, this kind of, in some ways, epitome of white colonial power in southern Africa became something which allowed black Zimbabweans to feed themselves. And next door in Zambia, it became something of a rallying call. The new Zambia in the 1960s was a far more urbanized country than Zimbabwe, needed food. And it basically stole the rice, learned how to create hybrids itself, and used it as part of its own green revolution. Even later, 1990s in Malawi, you can still find, even today, you can still find SR52 and its offspring as the main variety of rice in these countries. Ian Smith, Smith's a very unfortunate name if you're traveling through Zimbabwe, thinking of more embarrassing anecdotes. If you ever get stopped by a policeman, don't say your name's James Smith, because they just assume you're like the grandson or something. Ian Smith said when he declared he had a unilateral declaration of independence that Rhodesia would stand for 1,000 years. It stood for about 12 years, I think, and the rice still exists. It's still planted today by Africans. I think that says something about the complexity of transfer of technology. You can't control and decide where it's going to go. It goes where people want it. It does what people want. It's not just a transfer of knowledge, it's a transfer of politics and power and different sorts of futures too. So I think you can see in this the kind of diverse ways in which technology can take hold and have different impacts. And again, that's the sort of thing we have to bear in mind if we're thinking about critiquing these linear teleologies. So perhaps we have to think a bit more about science and tradition and backwardness and looking to the future. Perhaps you have to have a drink of water too. There's a whole set of received wisdoms about science. It's rational. Apologies to the scientists. Experiments are replicable. They can lead to transformational breakthroughs and is universal. Traditional knowledge, on the other hand, is embedded in environments. It's embedded locally. It's less prone to analytic reason and is closed. And this is a famous anthropologist I'm stealing words from here. And knowledge is neutrally and apolitically transferred from expert to non-expert. So it's the panoptic view of science which can solve the local problems where you can't see the wood for the trees. And science, because it's neutral, because it's apolitical, means that I'm doing it for the good of you, therefore you should accept it without question. Is this really the case? Can we really draw these sorts of conclusions? And I think the example of SR52 suggests not. So perhaps we need to rethink the relationship between science, indigenous knowledge, or our framing of modern life, or the sort of future we want. For example, it's the work of somebody who has a PhD in forestry, who is using GIS to model forest patterns in Indonesia, any different really from a farmer who practices intercropping, who's looking for his or her own way to make the best of their land. And to quote Paul Riches again, he says, everybody's a scientist. Some people just have degrees and letters after their name. Probably not an appropriate sentiment for an inaugural lecture, actually. So I think what this does then, it allows us to think of a post-development and post-science perspective in some ways, to be a bit more critical in thinking of the relationship between one and the other. And we can read development in science in alternative ways. They're social and political activities. They're not somehow separate and apart from the world. You don't stand or sit as somebody working for Oxfam, separate from what goes on around you and suggest how the world might run better. You're part of that world. And that's the same for scientists too. Everything is embedded in history and context. History and context isn't universal and it's not necessarily replicable. Things happen in different ways. And both generate narratives of truth, partly through their own history, their own perspective, their own view on the world, and partly through the networks, the tools and the expertise that they generate, the systems of expertise and power that they generate. And I think in particular, development and science and technology are quite synergistic. they kind of generate spaces that trade risk, abrogate responsibility, and shape societal relations, all under the guise of what's good for the world and what's apolitical and just. And I think the last point is kind of really strikes the heart of my own research interests. So I'll give you an example of this. I love titles more than I love actual presentations. I spend hours thinking of growing bananas, that's hilarious, and not much time putting the slides together, which is what I was doing at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Very naughty. This is a great quote, which I think strikes to the kind of hubris of scientists in some senses. In Africa, GM food could almost literally weed out poverty. Florence Wambugu is a Monsanto-funded scientist, or Florence Bamboozle, as I discovered when I last Googled her, is her name according to Greenpeace. And she's become something of an advocate for new technologies as a solution to Kenyan food security issues. And Kenya, in some ways, is a really fertile place to debate food insecurity and debate the role of technology, because it's the home of the UN in Africa. It's the home of 90 to 100,000 NGOs. There's a lot of international research centres there. It's kind of a hub of activity there, and Florence Wambugu is part of that. And what she does with her work, I would suggest, is she's very good at constructing problems and packaging solutions. She's probably less of a good scientist, but she's good at creating the sorts of networks of expertise that I was talking about in the last slide. So the narrative is bananas. We can't live without bananas. I can, as my darling wife will attest, when we were doing this fieldwork in 2005, I think, I don't like bananas. I really hate them. I used to like them when I was young with lots of sugar mashed up, but I grew out of childish things. So it's quite awkward. You're doing this fieldwork. You're going to speak to people growing bananas. You're speaking to scientists. They want you to taste their bananas all the time. So because Barbara was with me, I made her eat all the bananas, to the point when she was in bed sick for about a week, which went down particularly well, which is why I suggest that science and social science is a political thing. So this is a typical quote. Bananas and plantains, which are starchy cooking bananas, for those of you who don't know, are widely grown across the world's tropical regions. They are major food crops in developing countries. Bananas are also an important export crop to industrial countries. They're particularly important in East Africa, where they constitute the main staple food for about 50% of the population. In the case of my little sample, that 50% is Barbara, not me. In this part of the world, the annual consumption reaches over 400 kilograms per person. That's a lot of bananas. You can see here, if you actually look at the data and not at the kind of policy document, banana consumption in Kenya equates to 12 calories per capita per day, which I suggest is a lot less than 400 kilograms of bananas being consumed per person per day. One of Florence's projects, titled "The Biotechnology to Benefit Small-Scale Banana Producers in Kenya," again catchy, they should put me in charge of titles for these things, was developed in response to the rapid decline in banana production over the last 20 years. This decline was due to widespread soil degradation and the infestation of the nation's banana orchards with pests and diseases, problems further aggravated by the common practice of propagating new banana plants using infected suckers. The situation was threatening food security, employment, and incomes in banana-producing areas. I mean, how could you not want to solve that problem? Although, if you look at banana yields over the last 25, 30 years, they've actually more or less gone up, apart from in Tanzania. So again, the scientific narrative, the narrative which uses statistics and figures and kind of threat of big problems to justify a particular intervention, doesn't hold any water when you look at the actual data. And again, orchards aren't getting smaller. Orchards aren't being thrown into disrepair, which doesn't make sense. Actually, there's more bananas being planted, certainly in Kenya, than there have been in the past. So again, this narrative of decline, of a problem that needs to be solved, doesn't really work in reality. So what the solution from Florence's solution is to, if I go back a bit, is tissue culture. Here, what you do is you creating banana plantlets in sterile conditions. The logic being you're not passing the infections and the pests from one generation to the next. You're creating sterile plants, which can then be planted, and that the new generation should be more healthy. They cost about $2.50 each. So it's a significant investment for a small-scale farmer to plant these. If they're going to plant a whole orchard, which would be the recommendation, you're talking probably $300 or $400 US dollars for a small orchard. Think of the average annual income, it's a lot of money. So the rationale is yields will go up quite significantly. And this is an ex-ante study which suggests as much. Yields will double over a 14-year plantation cycle. The only peer-reviewed study on tissue culture bananas is of a controlled trial in South Africa from the 1980s, which suggests that banana yields are about 20% better at most in the first year, which tails off to nothing after 5 years because the new plants get infested, and that's just the way things go. These statistics, on the other hand, these graphs suggest something far more exciting, far more developmental. You can double yields. What doesn't make sense to me, looking at this, is I think we can probably assume that if you're planting tissue culture bananas, you have bananas in the ground already. Therefore, I don't understand why, if you're planting tissue culture bananas, you have a yield immediately, whereas you have to wait a year for the traditional bananas you've already got in the ground. So I think you can see the way in which the data is kind of twisted in a certain extent. And also, given the only study shows this increase doesn't exist, this doubling of yields doesn't exist, why this doubling of yield here? Why this optimistic return? And there's actually very good reason for this. If you read the paper very carefully, in one of the footnotes it said the data in the last slide were subject to optimum management techniques for tissue culture bananas. Tissue culture bananas are more susceptible to wind and too much sunlight. So the optimal management technique is to plant double the number of plants per hectare, which explains the doubling of yield. So basically the scientists, the development practitioners are saying, you invest $400 in planting these new bananas, you'll plant twice as many and you'll get twice as many back. It's perfect. For a food insecurity problem that doesn't exist. For an infestation problem that doesn't exist. And I think this shows the way in which the apolitics of development, the apolitics of science, don't really add up. I get more cheerful towards the end, I'm sorry. These narratives happen on a much grander scale, international, global, and liquid biofuels. Barbara said I should bring my new book to wave at you and punt and try and sell today, but I was too ashamed. Although it's on discount for Amazon for Christmas. It's basically a book looking at the kind of globalization of biofuel production. But biofuels, in some ways, liquid biofuels provide this kind of great narrative of policy and practice. They deal with energy security. They make us less reliant on Russia, on the Middle East, on Venezuela. We can replace fossil fuels with our own locally produced fuel. They're more environmentally friendly, at least in theory. They produce less greenhouse gases than fossil fuels. Developmentally, they can be a source of income for tropical countries, which have comparative advantages in that they're sunny, like South Africa, not like here. And at another level, they allow us to maintain a fossil fuel-driven economy because you're blending biofuels into normal fuels. So they hit all these sorts of points. They hit all these interest groups, which in other cases often kind of interact and fight and argue with each other. But this creates a narrative in which people can believe in. There's two types of first-generation biofuels: cereal crops, sugar, grains, starchy plants that can be fermented to produce bioethanol, and oilseed crops, sunflower, rape, seed, soy, palm, jatropha, which can be converted into biodiesel. There's a big risk of replacement or displacement of food crops. In the last year, 1 billion people, 2009, for the first time in measurable human history, 1 billion people were classified as food insecure. That was an increase of 250,000 over the kind of static figure of the last 20 years, partly attributable to staple food prices doubling over the last 5 years. At the same time, last year, US grain diverted to produce biofuel would have fed 330 million people. That's not to say that that grain would have literally fed people, because that's not the way the world works, but you can see how that has an impact on the price of food and access to food. In the same year, an area of Africa larger than the whole of the UK was planted with biofuel crops, or replacement crops to allow biofuel crops to be grown elsewhere. So these massive shifts, these massive changes around a relatively new technology that we know very little about in some respects, driven by narrative, driven by possibility, driven by the future. So biofuels are touted in some ways as the solution to all sorts of problems, but if we look at the data and look at the science behind it a bit, it's a bit more complex than that. If you were to combust, if you were to burn all the vegetation in the US, you'd meet only 1/3 of US energy demands for 1 year. Of course, you can burn it once, and that's it gone. So the notion that biofuels can replace fossil fuels just is absurd. It can only ever provide a very, very small proportion of energy demands. In the UK, if you were to convert 75% of all UK land over to biofuel production, you produce fuel for only 1 car per family. That's all the land, all the vegetation, all the plants in the UK. So again, it doesn't really add up. What happens then is you invest in Africa, where land and labor is cheapest, or in Latin America and Southeast Asia, where biomass is most plentiful. So you take your solution to the problem and impact elsewhere. So livelihoods, lands, and lives impacted elsewhere, and it's localized in poorer regions of the world, the tropics, where the comparative advantage exists because it's sunny. You could argue this is, in some ways, this is rational. For example, if greenhouse gas emissions were significantly lower, that they would have a positive effect on global warming, it might be worth doing this. Data is very mixed on this. We simply don't know very much about the environmental implications at a global level of biofuel production. Lifecycle analyses, which study the impact, the greenhouse gas releases from field to forecourt, don't encompass all costs of processing. They don't include impacts of all impacts of land use changes. They tend to be, there's a quite good quote, which is they tend to be kind of reverse Murphy's Law. You assume everything good that's going to happen will happen when you produce these sorts of analyses, which therefore create a narrative of biofuel investment as a good thing. So I think if you do more fuller accounting, which includes more detailed life cycle analyses, which looks at every single input of energy you have to make to realize the energy, which looks at the direct and indirect land use changes which have to happen in order to realize biofuel, things are quite different. For example, clearing Indonesian peatland, you would take 420 years to return an environmental benefit, because getting rid of the peat is releasing sequestered carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which you then have to buy back through the biofuel over a long period of time. And once the peatland's gone, it's gone forever. We're talking 20,000-year-old peatlands, 10,000-year-old rainforests. Or a simple life cycle analysis. If you do a simplistic analysis of corn-based ethanol in the US, you can produce a figure which says that 20% greenhouse gases are generated than for fossil fuels. If you produce a complex life cycle analysis where you include all the costs, then you're producing with the biofuel 2 times as much greenhouse gas as fossil fuel. So again, it's all in the framing, the expert systems that frame the technology in particular ways. So I think in some ways biofuels create a kind of triple bind. Greenhouse gas emissions have historically been disproportionately produced by the north, by us, with our cars, although mine's been stuck in ice for 10 days. The implications disproportionately threaten the south. Climate change will have a bigger effect on people in the south than it will for us. And finally, we're asking the south to alter their lives and livelihoods to allow us to perpetuate our lifestyles. We're saying, well, this investment must take place in Indonesia, Malaysia, South India, East Africa, Latin America. And this must happen to allow us to blend a bit of biofuel to make us feel a bit better more than anything else, I would suggest. So we kind of respond to the contradictions of sustainability by seeking to extend the agro-industrial complex into new ecological niches. So we're dealing with this contradiction by extending the contradiction into new parts of the world. And this is driven by policy, because it's not driven by rationality. It's driven by needs and investments and interest groups. Some things do work, though, and I've nearly finished, because I know it's getting a bit sad. M-Pesa. And I'm using this example because this is an example that a couple of my colleagues and one of my PhD students has been working on. It's really exploded in East Africa. Far more simple technology. I'll wave my mobile phone at you, but I've lost it, and I'm scared it will affect the PowerPoint. Basically, you can use a mobile phone, although not an iPhone, to text money to other people in Kenya. So I send a text message, I can transfer money to somebody else's account. They can then go to a person like this lady here who will then take the text message and give you the money. So basically it's a mini microcredit cash transfer scheme, very, very cheap. And it allows people to transfer money between urban and rural households, smooth income expenditure, hide money from drunken husbands who want to go to the pub, possibly, all sorts of things. And it's really taken off. There's 8,000 people like this lady who run these little shops where you can transfer money, and it's now being replicated across East Africa, notably Uganda. The initial investment was by DFID, the UK Department for International Development, but it's then been driven entirely by the private sector. So it's an example of development happening despite the apparatus, or separate from the apparatus of development. The ex-PhD student in question, who's the first person to look at this, Olga Morovchinska, is now setting up a similar PESA-style system in Uganda with the Grameen Bank, which won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago. So a similar thing is being replicated in other parts of Africa. I should also point out, because this really isn't all about me, I don't think, that two Central African Studies, Science and Technology Studies PhD students, their work on this sort of technology have been listed as two of the top 20 most influential studies of ICT for development in the last 5 years, which I think is important. This is where it goes pear-shaped, because this slide won't work now because of the mess up with the computer. What this slide would do if it worked, and it worked all day till about 4 o'clock, I was so happy, the bubbles kind of rose as time went by, and what you could see is, you have to imagine, the bubbles on the right represent Europe and North America. They rise more quickly because things develop more quickly. The bubbles in the center, the richer African countries, Southeast Asian countries, catch up and overtake. So what you can see is some technologies do allow this kind of catch-up, this kind of way for North and South to be both a little close together. Mobile phones, because they're cheap, because they're ubiquitous, allow this sort of technological transfer, this technological catch-up. It's a great slide, but it's not going to work, so I'll go on. Two last very quick case studies. You'll note that the things that work, the things I'm suggesting work, are in some ways the simplest things, but maybe based on quite complex science. And I can't spell sickness, good grief. You know, if I hadn't said that, you probably wouldn't have noticed, but I can't help myself. This is a very simple approach which has been pioneered by some of my colleagues at the front here to deal with sleeping sickness, the impacts of sleeping sickness in Uganda. Rather than create complex vaccines or expensive treatments, you kind of control sleeping sickness by treating the cattle with insecticide, which stops the cattle acting as a reservoir for the infection when they're bitten by tsetse fly. So basically, it's a gigantic version of what we put on our cats every couple of months to stop them getting fleas. And the uniqueness is not really the technology, although in some respects it is, because the technology has been conceptualized as being cheap enough and efficacious enough for this community, but the creation of a public-private partnership to allow the whole thing to happen sustainably. You have to treat enough cattle for the whole thing to work, 200,000 cattle monthly. And if you do that, you remove the reservoir of cows as a reservoir, and it stops sleeping sickness becoming such a big problem. So relatively cheap solution, relatively sustainable, understanding the local context. And finally, and I've only really got this particular slide here because I can tell another very embarrassing story about communication. I looked at this study, 2006, I think, and it's Bolivia, Peru. I thought rainforest, I can go to all sorts of nice places. I can climb on all sorts of Mayan ruins and that kind of thing. And I thought, I'll take Barbara with me because she deserves a holiday. She just finished her PhD at that point. So she came along, we went to the rainforest. I got bitten by all sorts of animals. Barbara was terrified of all sorts of spiders. We had a great time. And then I flew to Bolivia. And being British, I only speak English. And being British, I assume everybody else speaks English. Because in Africa and Southeast Asia, people, well, particularly Africa, particularly the ex-colonies, people speak English. Professionals, experts, scientists speak English. Here they don't, because they don't care about the UK. When they go to study overseas, they go to Spain or maybe Brazil, and they'll divert into Portuguese. So nobody spoke enough English to allow me to interview them, which is where Barbara's holiday became a heavy-duty, three-way language translating job for 2 whole weeks, which she's never forgiven me for. The technology, such as it is very simple. Papa Andina means potatoes of the Andes. It's very simple. The guy on the right with the blue top is one of my PhD students who works in this project. And all it really is, it's understanding that technology isn't about the science all the time. It's about the communication of new ideas and new perspectives. He basically brings together the entire market chain, the supermarket owners, the potato producers, the processors, the middlemen, makes them sit together and say, well, what's the problem? Why do the farmers not earn enough money? What kind of potatoes do you need to be produced? And he generates trust over about 10, 15 years. And there's kind of a smoothing of the imperfections in value chains. Very, very simple approach, which has been really effective. The project's engaged with tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of farmers across Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador over the last 10 years. And it's basically about communication as a technology in itself. So what I'm really saying is, forget linear models of innovation, forget linear models of change. It's about systems, complexity, mess, confusion. And out of mess and confusion and making mistakes, you can learn, you can organize, you can modify participation, you can affect people's behavior and perspectives in the world by communicating with them, by understanding what the benefits and implications might be, by being a little bit more transparent. It's a bit trite to say it's just participation, but participation is part of it. And the interconnection is important, because the interconnection, how well you know each other, how well you share information, how much you trust each other, how much you can bring your experience to bear on the lives of other people, determines how strong the communication, the network, the system in which change can take place can be. So even if single elements of systems are weak, the system can be strong. The system can be strong if you learn, if you build new competencies, if you recognize weakness and build on failure. And that's really where I think science and technology can make a difference for development. It's not in global biofuels. It's not necessarily in genomics, I apologize to Indian people. It's in these sorts of connections. It's in creating these sorts of synergies. This has profound implications. It means challenging professions, institutions, and interests. Maybe we're not as expert as we think we are. Maybe our institutions aren't as great as we think that they are. Maybe there's more appropriate places, spaces in which change can happen, in which new knowledge can be generated and shared. We need to reframe science and technology within development agendas, not as something conservative, but as something transformational. And we need to conceptualize science as transformational, not in a linear sense, not in driving us to the next stage of development, but in a relational sense. It can build new networks and new organizational relationships, new ways of communicating with each other. And it's those relations which will affect society and affect change. And we have to understand that science and technology aren't silver, magic, gold, platinum bullets. Although it's not really platinum, it's zirconium, it's cheaper. They're only part of any solution. They're part of something bigger. And again, communicating demands, communicating supply, communicating old and new knowledge in new ways is really important. It's about that sort of system, that sort of network. And I think ultimately and fundamentally, it's about taking responsibility today for development, not waiting until tomorrow for biofuels to change the world or some new technology that doesn't yet exist, fourth generation biofuels, an even smaller iPhone to abrogate our responsibility to poor people today. Going back to the slide, think 1948, the slide. For the first time, we have the knowledge, the technology to change the world. Gordon Brown, 6 years ago. Our shared conviction is that the barrier is not technology, money, or geography, but willpower and courage. With the science, technology, and knowledge available, we must face the truth. The real barrier is indifference. This says the same thing that the slide from 1948 said. So how much progress have we made? Is this a sense of déjà vu? Is this a point in which we can say we need to organize science and technology in a different way? And if my research can make a contribution, I would hope it's here. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank James for an illuminating, an exciting lecture and an insight into his relationship with his wife, which I'm sure will dog him for years in a variety of ways. There are drinks and nibbles next door in the Lorimer room if you'd like to join us through there, and if you'd like to join me again in thanking James for a wonderful inaugural lecture.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.